up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We all have our reasons why we are on this track. Oh, we all have our burdens, yeah, but we just keep on fighting and we never look back. Here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. When you feel it's hopeless, when you think that you lost, oh, I will take your hand and we'll rise up from the dust. Oh, here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We all have our reasons why we are on this track. Oh, we all have our burdens, yeah, but we just keep on fighting and we never look back. Here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone.
Okay, good evening. It is time for another reading from Fingerprints of the Gods. So we are on chapter 7. We read 7, 8, and 9 tonight. So it's been a good read so far. I'm enjoying it. Let's jump right on into it. Chapter 7, Were There Giants Then? Just after 6 in the morning, the little train jerked into motion and began its slow climb up the steep sides of the valley of Cuzco. The narrow gauge tracks were laid out in a series of Z shapes. We chugged along the lower horizontal of the first Z, then shunted and went backwards up the oblique, shunted again and went forward along the upper horizontal, and so on, with numerous stops and starts following a route that eventually took us high above the ancient city. The Inca walls and colonial palaces, the narrow streets, the cathedral of Santo Domingo, squatting atop the ruins of Viracocha's temple, all looked spectral and surreal in the pearl gray light of the dawn sky. A fairy pattern of electric lamps still decorated the streets. A thin mist seeped across the ground, and the smoke of domestic fires rose from the chimneys over the tiled roofs of countless small houses. Eventually, the train turned its back on Cuzco, and we proceeded for a while in a straight northwesterly direction toward our destination, Machu Picchu, the lost city of the Incas, some 3 hours and 130 kilometers away. I had intended to read, but lulled by the rocking motion of the carriage, I dropped off to sleep instead. 50 minutes later, I awoke to find that we were passing through a painting. The foreground, brightly sunlit, consisted of flat green meadows sprinkled with little patches of thawing frost distributed on either side of a stream across a long, wide valley. In the middle of my view, dotted with bushes, was a large field on which a handful of black and white dairy cows grazed. Nearby was a scattered settlement of houses, outside which stood small, dark-skinned Quechua. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but that's what we'll go with. Quechua Indians dressed in ponchos, balaclavas, and colorful woolen hats. More distant were slopes canopied in fir trees and exotic eucalyptus. My eye followed the rising contours of a pair of high green mountains, which then parted to reveal folded and even more lofty uplands. Beyond these soared a far horizon surmounted by a jagged range of radiant and snowy peaks, casting down the giants. It was with understandable reluctance that I turned at last to my reading. I wanted to look more closely at some of the curious links I thought I had identified connecting the sudden appearance of Viracocha to the deluge legends of the Incas and other Andean peoples. Before me was a passage from Friar Jose de Acosta's Natural and Moral History of the Indies, in which the learned priest set out what the Indians themselves report of their beginning, quote unquote. Quote, they make great mention of a deluge which happened in their country. The Indians say that all men were drowned in the deluge, and they report that out of Lake Titicaca came one Viracocha who stayed in Tiwanaku, where at this day there are to be seen the ruins of ancient and very strange buildings, and from thence came to Cuzco, and so began mankind to multiply, end quote. Making a mental note to find out more about Lake Titicaca, and the mysterious Tiwanaku, I read the following passage summarizing a legend from the Cuzco area. Quote, for some crime unstated, the people who lived in the most ancient times were destroyed by the Creator in a deluge. After the deluge, the Creator appeared in human form from Lake Titicaca. He then created the sun and moon and stars. After that, he renewed the human population of the earth, end quote. In another myth, quote, the great creator god Viracocha decided to make a world for men to live in. First he made the earth and sky, then he began to make people to live in it, carving great stone figures of giants which he brought to life. At first all went well, but after a time the giants began to fight among themselves and refused to work. Viracocha decided that he must destroy them. Some he turned back into stone, the rest he overwhelmed with a great flood. End quote. Very similar notions were of course found in other quite unconnected sources, such as the Jewish Old Testament. In chapter 6 of the book of Genesis, for example, which describes the Hebrew God's displeasure with his creation and his decision to destroy it, I had long been intrigued by one of the few descriptive statements made about the forgotten era before the flood. According to the enigmatic language of that statement, quote, there were giants in the earth in those days, end quote, Could the giants buried in the biblical sands of the Middle East be connected in some unseen way to the giants woven into the fabric of the pre-Columbian Native American legends? Adding considerably to the mystery was the fact that the Jewish and Peruvian sources both went on with many further details in common to depict an angry deity unleashing a catastrophic flood upon a wicked and disobedient world. On the next page of the sheaf of documents I had assembled was this Inca account of the deluge handed down by a certain Father Molina in his Relación de las Fábulas y Ritos de los Incas. I know, I butchered the hell out of that. Quote, in the life of Manco Capac, who was the first Inca, and from whom they began to boast themselves children of the sun, and from whom they derived their idolatrous worship of the sun, they had an ample account of the deluge. They say that in it perished all races of men and created things, insomuch that the waters rose above the highest mountain peaks in the world. No living thing survived except a man and a woman who remained in a box, and when the waters subsided, the wind carried them to Tiwanaku, where the Creator began to raise up the people and the nations that are in that region. End quote. Garcilaso de la Vega, the son of the Spanish nobleman and an Inca royal woman, was already familiar to me from his royal commentaries of the Incas. He was regarded as one of the most reliable chroniclers of the traditions of his mother's people, and had done his work in the 16th century, soon after the conquest, when those traditions had not yet been contaminated by foreign influences. He too confirmed what had obviously been a universal and deeply impressed belief. Quote, after the waters of the deluge had subsided, a certain man appeared in the country of Tiwanaku. End quote. That man had been Viracocha. Wrapped in his cloak, he was strong and, quote, august of countenance, end quote, and walked with unassailable confidence through the most dangerous badlands. He worked miracles of healing and could call down fire from heaven. To the Indians it must have seemed that he had materialized from nowhere. Ancient traditions. We were now more than 2 hours into our journey to Machu Picchu, and the panorama had changed. Huge black mountains, upon which not a trace of snow remained to reflect the sunlight, towered darkly above us, and we seemed to be running through a rocky defile at the end of a narrow valley filled with somber shadows. The air was cold, and so were my feet. I shivered and resumed reading. One thing was obvious. Amid the confused web of legends I had reviewed, legends which supplemented one another but also at times conflicted, all the scholars agreed that the Incas had borrowed, absorbed, and passed on the traditions of many of the different civilized peoples over whom they had extended their control during the centuries of expansion of their vast empire. In this sense, whatever the outcome of the historical debate over the antiquity of the Incas themselves, nobody could seriously dispute their role as transmitters of the ancient belief systems of all the great archaic cultures, coastal and highland, known and unknown, that had preceded them in this land. And who could say just what civilizations might have existed in Peru in the unexplored regions of the past? Every year, archaeologists come up with new findings which extend the horizons further and further back in time. So why shouldn't they one day discover evidence of the penetration into the Andes in remote antiquity of a race of civilizers who had come from overseas and gone away again after completing their work? That was what the legends seemed to me to be suggesting. Legends that most of all and most clearly had immortalized the memory of the man/god Viracocha, striding the high windswept byways of the Andes, working miracles wherever he went. Quote, Viracocha himself with his two assistants journeyed north. He traveled up the Cordillera. One assistant went along the coast, the other up the edge of the eastern forests. The Creator proceeded to Urcos, near Cuzco, where he commanded the future population to emerge from a mountain. He visited Cusco and then continued north to Ecuador. There in the coastal province of Manta, he took leave of his people and, walking on the waves, disappeared across the ocean. Quote, end quote. There was always this poignant moment of goodbye at the end of every folk memory featuring the remarkable stranger whose name meant foam of the sea. Quote, Viracocha went on his way, calling forth the races of men. When he came to the district of Porto Viejo, he was joined by his followers whom he had sent on before, and when they had joined him, he put to sea in their company, and they say that he and his people went by water as easily as they had traversed the land. End quote. Always this poignant goodbye, and often a hint of science or magic. Time capsule. Outside the window of the train, things were happening. To my left, swollen with dark water, I could see the Urubamba, a tributary of the Amazon and a river sacred to the Incas. The air temperature had warmed up noticeably. We had descended into a relatively low-lying valley with its own tropical microclimate. The mountain slopes rising on either side of the tracks were densely covered in green forests, and I was reminded that this was truly a region of vast and virtually insuperable obstacles. However, whoever had ventured all this way into the middle of nowhere to build Machu Picchu must have had a very strong motive for doing so. Whatever the reason had been, the choice of such a remote location had at least one beneficial side effect. Machu Picchu was never found by the conquistadors and friars during their days of destructive zeal. Indeed, it was not until 1911, when the fabulous heritage of older races was beginning to be treated with greater respect, that a young American explorer, Hiram Bingham, revealed Machu Picchu to the world. It was realized at once that this incredible site opened a unique window on pre-Columbian civilization. In consequence, the ruins were protected from looters and souvenir hunters, and an important chunk of the enigmatic past was preserved to amaze future generations. Having passed through a one-horse town named Agua Caliente, hot water, where a few broken-down restaurants and cheap bars leered at travelers from beside the tracks, we reached Machu Picchu Puentas Ruinas station at 10 minutes past 9 in the morning. From here, a half-hour bus ride on a winding dirt road on the side of a steep and forbidding mountain brought us to Machu Picchu itself, to the ruins, and to a bad hotel which charged us a nonsensical amount of money for a not very clean room. We were the only guests. Though it had been years since the local guerrilla movement had last bombed the Machu Picchu train, not many foreigners were keen to come here anymore. Machu Picchu dreaming. It was 2 in the afternoon. I stood on a high point at the southern end of the site. The ruins stretched out northwards in lichen-enshrouded terraces before me. Thick clouds were wrapped in a ring around the mountain tops, but the sunlight still occasionally burst through here and there. Way down on the valley floor, I could see the sacred river curled in a hairpin loop right around the central formation on which Machu Picchu was based, like a moat surrounding a giant castle. The river showed deep green from this vantage point, reflecting the greenness of the steep jungle slopes, and there were patches of white water and wonderful sparkling gleams of light. I gazed across the ruins towards the dominant peak. Its name is Huayna Picchu, and it used to feature in all the classic travel agency posters of this site. To my astonishment, I now observed that for 100 meters or so below its summit, it had been neatly terraced and sculpted. Somebody had been up there and had carefully raked the near vertical cliffs into a graceful hanging garden which had perhaps in ancient times been planted with bright flowers. It seemed to me that the entire site, together with its setting, was a monumental work of sculpture composed in part of mountains, in part of rock, in part of trees, in part of stones, and also in part of water. It was a heart-achingly beautiful place, certainly one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. Despite its luminous brilliance, however, I felt that I was gazing down onto a city of ghosts. It was like the wreck of the Mary Celeste, deserted and restless. The houses were arranged in long terraces. Each house was tiny, with just one room fronting directly onto the narrow street, and the architecture was solid and functional, but by no means ornate. By way of contrast, certain ceremonial areas were engineered to an infinitely higher standard and incorporated giant blocks similar to those I had seen at Sacsayhuaman. One smoothly polished polygonal monolith was around 12 feet long by 5 feet wide by 5 feet thick and could not have weighed less than 200 tons. How had the ancient builders managed to get it up here? Okay, and now we have a picture of Machu Picchu. It's a line drawing. So let me bring that up. I'll blow it up as much as I can. And I can actually move it, so I'm going to blow it up quite a bit. And I'll show you. So obviously this means north. So Intihuatana, I don't know what that means. Principal temple. And then I can move it up. So I would presume that these are the terraces he was talking about, or some of them at least. And here too. There were dozens of others like it too, and they were all arranged in the familiar jigsaw puzzle walls of interlocking angles. On one block, I was able to count a total of 33 angles, every one intermeshed faultlessly with a matching angle on an adjoining block. There were massive polygons and perfect ashlars with razor-sharp edges. There were also natural unhewn boulders integrated into the overall design at a number of points, and there were strange and unusual devices such as the Intihuatana, the hitching post of the sun, quote unquote. These remarkable artifact, this a remarkable artifact consisted of an elemental chunk of bedrock, gray and crystalline, carved into a complex geometrical form of curves and angles, incised niches and external buttresses surmounted at the center by a stubby vertical prong. Jigsaw puzzle. How old is Machu Picchu? The academic consensus is that the city could not have been built much earlier than the 15th century AD. Dissenting opinions, however, have from time to time been expressed by a number of more daring but respectable scholars. In the 1930s, for example, Rolf Mueller, professor of astronomy at the University of Potsdam, found convincing evidence to suggest that the most important features of Machu Picchu possessed significant astronomical alignments. From these, through the use of detailed mathematical computations concerning star positions in the sky in previous millennia, which gradually alter down the epochs as a result of a phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes, Mueller concluded that the original layout of the site could only have been accomplished during the era of 4000 BC to 2000 BC. In terms of Orthodox history, this was a heresy of audacious proportions. If Mueller was right, Machu Picchu was not a mere 500, but could be as much as 6,000 years old. This would make it significantly older than the Great Pyramid of Egypt, assuming, of course, that one accepted the Great Pyramid's own Orthodox dating of around 2500 BC. There were other dissenting voices concerning the antiquity of Machu Picchu, and most, like Mueller, were convinced that parts of the site were thousands of years older than the date favored by Orthodox historians. Like the big polygonal blocks that made up the walls, this was a notion that looked as though it might fit with other pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. In this case, the jigsaw puzzle of a past that didn't quite make sense anymore. Viracocha was part of that same puzzle. All the legends said his capital had been at Tiwanaku. The ruins of this great and ancient city lay across the border in Bolivia in an area known as the Callao, 12 miles south of Lake Titicaca. We could get there, I calculated, in a couple of days via Lima and La Paz. And that is the end of chapter 7. So we'll jump right on into chapter 8. The lake at the roof of the world. La Paz, the capital city of Bolivia, nestles in the uneven bottom of a spectacular hole in the ground more than 2 miles above sea level. This plunging ravine, thousands of feet deep, was carved in some primeval age by a tremendous downrush of water that carried with it an abrasive tide of loose rocks and rubble. Provided by nature with such an apocalyptic setting, La Paz possesses a unique, though slightly sleazy charm. With its narrow streets, dark-walled tenements, imposing cathedrals, garish cinemas, and hamburger bars open till late, it generates an atmosphere of quirky intrigue which is oddly intoxicating. It's hard going for the pedestrian, however, unless equipped with lungs like bellows, because the whole of the central district is built up and down the sides of precipitous hills. La Paz Airport is almost 5,000 feet higher than the city itself, on the edge of the Antiplano, the cold, rolling uplands that are the dominant topographical feature of this region. Santa and I landed there well after midnight on a delayed flight from Lima. In the drafty arrivals hall, we were offered cocoa tea in little plastic cups as a prophylactic against altitude sickness. After considerable coca tea. Coca tea. Okay. I read it as cocoa tea. Sorry, it's coca. So, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that had a coca leaf in it, which is the source of cocaine, and it was chewed originally for, in part, altitude sickness. Anyway, as a prophylactic against altitude sickness. After considerable delay and exertion, we extracted our luggage from customs, hailed an ancient American-made taxi, and clanked and rattled down toward the dim yellow lights of the city far below. And now we have a picture of Lake Titicaca, also showing where it is in South America. So let me bring that up. Okay, so Lake Titicaca, very, very large lake. Right there in the western part. And then this, I don't know if you can read that, it's pointing to this dot as being Tiahuanaco, this as being La Paz. Around 4 o'clock the next afternoon, we set off for Lake Titicaca in a rented Jeep, fought our way through the capital's incomprehensible permanent rush hour traffic jams, then drove up out of the skyscrapers and slums into the wide, clear horizons of the Antiplano. At first, still close to the city, our route took us through a zone of bleak suburbs and sprawling shanty towns where the sidewalks were lined with auto repair shops and scrap yards. The more distance we put between ourselves and La Paz, however, the more attenuated the settlements became, until almost all signs of human habitation ceased. The empty, treeless, undulating savannas, distantly bordered by the snow-covered peaks of the Cordillera Real, created an unforgettable spectacle of natural beauty and power, but there was also a feeling of otherworldliness about this place, which seemed to float above the clouds like an enchanted kingdom. Although our ultimate destination was Tiahuanaco, we were aiming that night for the town of Copacabana, on a promontory near the southern end of Lake Titicaca. To reach it, we had to cross a neck of water by improvised car ferry at the fishing town of Tiquine. Then, with dusk descending, we followed the main highway, now little more than a narrow and uneven track, up a series of steep hairpin bends and onto the shoulder of a mountain spur. From this point, a contrasting panorama unfolded. The dark, dark waters of the lake below appeared to lie at the edge of a limitless ocean drowned in somber shadows, and yet the jagged peaks of the snow-capped mountains in the distance were still drenched in dazzling sunlight. From the very beginning, Lake Titicaca seemed to me a special place. I knew that it lay some 12,500 feet above sea level, that the frontier between Peru and Bolivia passed through it, that it covered an area of 3,200 square miles and was 138 miles long by about 70 miles wide. I also knew it was deep, reaching almost 1,000 feet in places, and had a puzzling geological history. Here are the mysteries and some of the solutions that have been proposed. These are fairly long and they are numbered. 1. Though now more than 2 miles above sea level, the area around Lake Titicaca is littered with millions upon millions of fossilized seashells. This suggests that at some stage the whole of the Altiplano was forced upwards from the seabed, perhaps as part of the general terrestrial rising that formed South America as a whole. In the process, great quantities of ocean water, together with countless myriads of living marine creatures, were scooped up and suspended among the Andean ranges. This is thought to have happened not more recently than about 100 million years ago. 2. Paradoxically, despite the mighty antiquity of this event, Lake Titicaca has retained until the present day a marine ichthyofauna. In other words, though now located hundreds of miles from any ocean, its fish and crustacea feature many oceanic rather than freshwater types. Surprising creatures brought to the surface in fishermen's net have included examples of hippocampus, the seahorse. In addition, as an authority has pointed out, quote, the various species of Alarquestas, Hyalaela inermis, etc., and other examples of marine fauna leave no doubt that this lake in other periods was much saltier than today, or more accurately, that the water which formed it was from the sea, and that it was dammed up and locked in the Andes when the continent rose. End quote. Number 3. So much then for the events which may have created Lake Titicaca in the first place. Since its formation, this great interior sea and the Altiplano itself has undergone several other drastic and dramatic changes. Of these, by far the most notable is that the lake's extent appears to have fluctuated enormously, indicated by the existence of an ancient strand line visible on much of the surrounding terrain. Puzzlingly, this strand line is not level but slopes markedly from north to south over a considerable horizontal distance. At the northernmost point surveyed, it is as much as 290 feet higher than Titicaca. Some 400 miles farther south, it is 274 feet lower than the present level of the lake. From this and much other evidence, geologists have deduced that the Altiplano is still gradually rising, but in an unbalanced manner, with greater altitudes being attained in the northern part and lesser in the southern. The process involved here is thought to have less to do with changes in the level of Titicaca's waters themselves, although such changes have certainly occurred, than the changes in the level of the whole terrain in which the lake is situated. Number 4. Much harder to explain in such terms, however, given the very long time periods major geological transformations are supposed to require, is irrefutable evidence that the city of Tiahuanaco was once a port, complete with extensive docks positioned right on the shore of Lake Titicaca. The problem is that Tiahuanaco's ruins are now marooned about 12 miles south of the lake and more than 100 feet higher than the present shoreline. In the period since the city was built, it therefore follows that one of two things must have happened. Either the level of the lake has fallen greatly, or the land on which Tiahuanaco stands has risen comparably. 5. Either way is obvious that there have been massive and traumatic physical changes. Some of these, such as the rise of the Altiplano from the floor of the ocean, certainly took place in remote geological ages, before the advent of human civilization. Others are not nearly so ancient and must have occurred after the construction of Tiahuanaco. The question, therefore, is this: when was Tiahuanaco built? Quote, and then we have a quote. The orthodox historical view is that the ruins cannot possibly be dated much earlier than AD 500. An alternative chronology also exists, however, which, although not accepted by the majority of scholars, seems more in tune with the scale of the geological upheavals that have occurred in this region. Based on the mathematical/astronomical calculations of Professor Arthur Poznansky of the University of La Paz and of Professor Rolf Mueller, who also challenged the official dating of Machu Picchu, it pushes the main phase of construction at Tiahuanaco back to 15,000 BC. This chronology also indicates that the city later suffered immense destruction in a phenomenal natural catastrophe around the 11th millennium BC, and therefore rapidly became separated from the lakeshore. That would be the end of the Younger Dryas, I believe. End quote. We shall be reviewing Poznansky's and Mueller's findings in Chapter 11, findings which suggest that the great Andean city of Tiahuanaco flourished during the last ice age in the deep, dark, moonless midnight of prehistory. And that is actually the end of that chapter. That was a very short one. This next one is also pretty short, but in order to keep the readings even as far as the number of chapters, I'm just going to end with this chapter 9. And that'll leave 3 more chapters to finish out part 2 of the book. So, here we go. Chapter 9, Once and Future King. During my travels in the Andes, I had several times reread a curious variant of the mainstream tradition of Viracocha. In this variant, which was from the area around Lake Titicaca, known as the Callao, no, I completely read that wrong. I'm going to say Callao, just because it's easy. Collao. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm sure I am. Let me know. So let me start that sentence again. In this variant, which was from the area around Lake Titicaca, known as the Callao, the deity civilizing hero had been named Thunupa. Quote, Thunupa appeared on the Altiplano in ancient times, coming from the north with 5 disciples. A white man of august presence, blue-eyed and bearded, he was sober, puritanical, and preached against drunkenness, polygamy, and war. End quote. After traveling great distances through the Andes, where he created a peaceful kingdom and taught men all the arts of civilization, Thunupa was struck down and grievously wounded by a group of jealous conspirators. Quote, they put his blessed body in a boat of Totoro rush and set it adrift on Lake Titicaca. There he sailed away with such speed that those who had tried so cruelly to kill him were left behind in terror and astonishment, for this lake has no current. The boat came to the shore at Cochamarca, where today is the river Desguardero. Indian tradition asserts that the boat struck the land with such force it created the river Desquedero, which before then did not exist, and on the water so released, the holy body was carried many leagues away to the sea coast at Arica. End quote. Boats, water, and salvation. There are curious parallels here to the story of Osiris, the ancient Egyptian high god of death and resurrection. The fullest account of the original myth defining this mysterious figure is given by Plutarch, and says that after bringing the gifts of civilization to his people, teaching them all manner of useful skills, abolishing cannibalism and human sacrifice, and providing them with their first legal code, Osiris left Egypt and traveled about the world to spread the benefits of civilization to other nations as well. He never forced the barbarians he encountered to accept his laws, preferring instead to argue with them and to appeal to their reason. It is also recorded that he passed on his teachings to them by means of hymns and songs accompanied by musical instruments. While he was gone, however, he was plotted against by 72 members of his court, led by his brother-in-law Set. On his return, the conspirators invited him to a banquet where a splendid coffer of wood and gold was offered as a prize to any guest who could fit into it exactly. Osiris did not know that the coffer had been constructed precisely to his body measurements. As a result, when the assembled guests tried one by one to get into it, they failed. Osiris lay down comfortably inside. Before he had time to get out, the conspirators rushed forward, nailed the lid tightly closed, and sealed even the cracks with molten lead so that there would be no air. The coffer was then thrown into the Nile. It had been intended that it would sink, but it floated rapidly away, drifting for a considerable distance until it reached the seacoast. At this point, the goddess Isis, wife of Osiris, intervened. Using all the great magic for which she was renowned, she found the coffer and concealed it in a secret place. However, her evil brother Set, out hunting in the marshes, discovered the coffer, opened it, and in a mad fury cut the royal corpse into 14 pieces, which he scattered throughout the land. Once more Isis set off to save her husband. She made a small boat of papyrus reeds, coated with pitch, and embarked on the Nile in search of the remains. When she had found them, she worked powerful spells to reunite the dismembered parts of the body, so that it resumed its old form. Thereafter, in an intact and perfect state, Osiris went through a process of stellar rebirth to become god of the dead and king of the underworld, from which place, legend had it, he occasionally returned to earth in the guise of a mortal man. Although there are huge differences between the traditions, it is bizarre that Osiris in Egypt and Thunupa Viracocha in South America should have had all of the following points in common. And this is a bulleted list, so I'll number them just for convenience. 1. Both were great civilizers. 2. Both were conspired against. 3. Both were struck down. 4. Both were sealed inside a container or vessel of some kind. 5. Both were then cast into water. 6. Both drifted away on a river. 7. Both eventually reached the sea. Are such parallels to be dismissed as coincidences, or could there be some underlying connection? Reed boats of Surukwai. The air was alpine cold, and I was sitting on the front of a motor launch doing about 20 knots across the icy waters of Lake Titicaca. The sky above was clear blue, reflecting aquamarine and turquoise tints inshore, and the vast body of the lake, glinting in copper and silver tones, seemed to stretch away forever. The passages in the legends that spoke of vessels made of reeds needed to be followed up because I knew that boats of totora rush were a traditional form of transport on this lake. However, the ancient skills required to build craft of this type had atrophied in recent years, and we were now headed towards Surukwai, the one place where they were still properly made. On Surukwai Island, in a small village close to the lake shore, I found 2 elderly Indians making a boat from bundled totora rushes. The elegant craft, which appeared to be nearly complete, was approximately 15 feet long. It was wide amidships, but narrow at either end, with a high, curving prow and stern. I sat down for a while to watch. The more senior of the two builders, who wore a brown felt hat over a curious, peaked woolen cap, repeatedly braced his bare left foot against the side of the vessel to give additional leverage as he pulled and tightened the cords that held the bundles of reeds in place. From time to time I noticed that he rubbed a length of cord against his own perspiring brow, thus moistening it to increase its adhesion. The boat, surrounded by chickens and occasionally investigated by a shy, browsing alpaca, stood amid a litter of discarded rushes in the backyard of a ramshackle farmhouse. It was one of several I was able to study over the next few hours, and though the setting was unmistakably Andean, I found myself repeatedly overtaken by a sense of déjà vu from another place and another time. The reason was that the Totora vessels of Suruquai were virtually identical, both in the method of construction and in finished appearance, to the beautiful craft fashioned from papyrus reeds in which the pharaohs had sailed the Nile thousands of years previously. In my travels in Egypt I had examined the images of many such vessels painted on the walls of ancient tombs. It sent a tingle down my spine to see them now so colorfully brought to life on an obscure island on Lake Titicaca, even though my research had partially prepared me for this coincidence. I knew that no satisfactory explanation had ever been given for how such close and richly detailed similarities of boat design could occur in two such widely separated places. Nevertheless, in the words of one authority in ancient navigation who had addressed himself to this conundrum, quote, "Here was the same compact shape, peaked and raised at both ends, with rope lashings running from the deck right round the bottom of the boat, all in one piece. Each straw was placed with maximum precision to achieve perfect symmetry and streamlined elegance, while the bundles were so tightly lashed that they looked like gilded logs bent into a clog-shaped peak fore and aft." End quote. The reed boats of the ancient Nile and the reed boats of Lake Titicaca, the original design of which local Indians insisted had been given to them by the Viracocha people, had other points in common. Both, for example, were equipped with sails mounted on peculiar two-legged straddled masts. Both had also been used for the long-distance transport of exceptionally heavy building materials, obelisks and gargantuan blocks of stone bound for the temples of Giza and Luxor and Abydos on the one hand, and for the mysterious edifices of Tiahuanaco on the other. In those far-off days before Lake Titicaca became more than 100 feet shallower, Tiahuanaco had stood at the water's edge overlooking a vista of awesome and sacred beauty. Now the great port capital city of Viracocha himself lay lost amid eroded hills and empty, windswept plains. Road to Tiahuanaco. After returning from Suruquai to the mainland, we drove our hired jeep across those plains, raising a cloud of dust. Our route took us through the towns of Pucarani and Laja, populated by stolid Aymara Indians who walked slowly in the narrow cobbled streets and sat placidly in the little sunlit plazas. Were these people the descendants of the builders of Tiahuanaco, as the scholars insisted, or were the legends right? Had the ancient city been the work of foreigners with godlike powers who had settled here long ages ago? And that is the end of chapter 9. So, we will pick up there next time. And all three of these next chapters are going to be fairly short too, but that's just the way it is. I don't have 6 chapters in me for one night, though, so my voice won't hold out. So we'll do those next chapters on Friday, and that'll get us into part 3 of the book, which is the Plumed Serpent, Central America. That'll be interesting. So, all right. I am just going to call it there, and I will see you all tomorrow night for Star Wars. We've got some more short stories to get through there, so see you then. Have a good night.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations.